right.
Back for our inaugural episode one, not our origin story, but our first official topic of this podcast.
There you
What are we
go.
talking about today, Fred? What's our theme?
Yes, we're talking about cloud management.
Oh man, this is going to rub a few people the wrong way.
It
Maybe. Let's
is.
see. Before
We've
we get
just
into that,
we're,
though.
we're just on our second episode and we're already starting controversial stuff, aren't we?
Oh dear. Before we get into the topic, though, I think we wanted to really introduce a little small couple of minutes at the start of each episode just to discuss something interesting that we might have read about in the news lately. One thing that I read about this week was around Salt Typhoon and how, um, you know, different nation state actors have gotten into US telcos. They've been, replicating traffic, obtaining, phone calls, metadata on users, all sorts, right? Um, and I mean, there were, places apparently in Asia Pacific and Europe, other service providers that were attacked. So it just made me really think about, and I know this is a topic more for like SASE and other things, but just how like untrusted so many networks are. And then the resolution for it was that, some agency in the US is going to formalize that these businesses have like a cybersecurity plan. And it was at that point I'm like, but these guys are big enough; they should have one already, right?
Yeah.
It it blows my mind, but it is still very relevant to our topic today of cloud management,
Correct.
and what
Yes.
we're going to be talking about. So we'll be looking to talk about the good old days or the bad old days that
The
we
good
have it
old
as we
days.
have it in our
Yes.
run sheet here.
Yeah.
Obviously, the risk associated with it, but then what else we're trying to do to obviously mitigate that risk,
Mhm.
software-defined networking, and then of course we end up with the close at the end of the episode.
That brings a
Um,
throwback there, right? Isn't it? The software defined term. I haven't heard that software defined networking used in that sense in, oh, geez, ages.
yeah, that's another point where that's probably something, some other marketing nomenclature a lot of listeners probably don't want to hear or remember anymore. Um, But let's roll right into the episode because we are trying to keep these to a 30-minute max just for that, drive into work. So looking back, Fred,
Yeah.
right now, a lot of IT vendors these days, they're all starting to offer cloud-based solutions for, you know, handling your networks. Um, and as you kindly point out, obviously there are obviously different options, right? There's fully managed, there's
Yeah.
monitoring, and there's some sort of hybrid solutions to think about. But before we get into that piece, maybe it might be good to just hear from you. Go back in time. Consider when you learned CLI. Tell me, what were the pros and cons of being in CLI for you back then?
Starting out my career in IT, you coming out as a freshly graduated engineer from uni, you realize that, oh, these are stuff that you can't learn from school unless you attended, one of those academies. Cisco notably has one of those Cisco Networking Academy programs where you get hands-on time with actual routers. Guess my age? That that time the 2600 was still pretty much a new thing.
Oh, that's a throwback.
Yes, that was a while ago. So you never knew how to you never knew how to play around with these things, and you don't know better, like, to you being able to configure something and actually get two networks talking. That in itself felt like an achievement, right?
Oh, mate, and we made jokes on the last episode about frame relay, but when you actually got frame relay to work or to like get packets flowing between two frame relay networks, man, you felt like a king, even if you never actually had the opportunity to use it after you actually learned it, right? Um, yeah.
And those CLI commands that you were using, like with the syntax and all the commands and all that other stuff that you've dealt with, like I traditionally come from a Cisco background, so uh, how you configure those stuff, you know what the keywords are, what the fine-tuning metrics are. You get to learn that along the way. Apparently, at that time, it felt very modern because the predecessors were a lot worse. Imagine trying to do programming. Like nowadays, Python is pretty much self-explanatory.
Yeah.
You pretty much can understand what the code does by reading through it, pretty much. But think of the days. So if Python were the days of iOS and CLI commands, think of the predecessor of that in previous generations. And this I learned back when I started. The configuration lines don't make don't make a lot of sense to someone who doesn't know. It's
Yep.
like programming in assembly. Wink, wink. Some people might actually relate and know what that means. It's like programming in assembly, doing configuration line commands before the iOS command line came about.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, gone are those, thank God those days are gone. Not not to say that, CLI was ever perfect either, right? I think many of us were always caught up in the bug of, when you wanted to add a VLAN to a trunk, if you didn't use the add
The
command
co-
at the end, you ended up tearing off every VLAN off the trunk and just replacing it with the one that
yes.
you were trying to add in the first place, and the network comes crashing down.
Oh, absolutely. So
Oh
there's a
God.
thrill that goes with it. Plus, think about it this way. The network engineer felt really needed and powerful then because
Mm,
unless you spent time studying the technology, you probably would have no idea what those command lines are doing. Like
mm.
I had a non-technical I had some friends who are not working in IT who happened to overhear me when I was talking BGP to a customer, and they go, what sort of alien language is this guy talking about?" That's how I sounded to them. And sometimes stroking the human's ego, that felt really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can imagine. And I think CLI had its place, right? In that the good part of it was that it gave you the ability to learn these crazy concepts, like even thinking about something simple like spanning tree, but then understanding obviously the different, priority numbers that you have to set and how setting that priority changes, like, influences the network and the shape of it. Like, that's just at a layer two level. And then you go up to routing and you're adjusting whether it's cost for OSPF or, other parameters for something like EIGRP, or if you're doing just completely batshit insane things with BGP, right? Yeah, it affords you that space, right? And at that same token, networks these days, at least I don't feel in sort of my perspective and in the conversations I have with people, are not that complicated as they once used to be, right? Like
Yes.
we brought up frame relay earlier, but a lot of those, serial handoffs, things like that, that's all days
It's
gone
background
pre
stuff, right? Like
predominantly, right?
it helps to
ISDN
know
is
them, but
now,
you don't have to worry about configuring them. Well, not
yeah,
so much.
not so much anymore, right? There may be that, out in the middle of nowhere, the ISPs haven't changed the model for that area. So, you have to maybe drop something in there, but it's more or less things have really come and standardized, right? Whether that's like SIM trucks are now Ethernet, all your MPLS handoffs are predominantly Ethernet, even the service provider drops a router onto your premise, right? It's all fairly relatively straightforward these days,
Correct.
right? Relatively speaking.
Let's call it as it is, Vlad. We technology, or at least the vendors, have made these technologies as foolproof and as idiot proof as they can.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's
Yeah.
actually one of the main drivers behind cloud management, or a prior evolution is actually GUI or GUI based management,
Yep.
right? So I mean, if you're a cloud managed solution, it's very likely that you're operating at some graphical user level of interface for you
Yep.
to manage your network or your infrastructure.
Yep. Yep. No, that makes complete sense. And I'm thinking now that, like GUIs have extrapolated a lot of that. But still, you need to understand, regardless, a lot of those concepts, right? Like even on a Meraki dashboard, for example, you still need to understand how a spanning tree functions. You still need to
Correct.
understand all of those concepts. It's just you no longer have to input them as CLI, rather
Correct.
that's extrapolated as a couple of numbers on a click to a dashboard, right? Which is
Correct.
not necessarily a bad thing in my purview. If I were a busy IT engineer, I don't want to be stuck in
Oh,
CLI.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, CLI is just error prone. If you are, you know, pre-building your configuration in such a structure as a text-based file, you're still pretty much typing stuff down. Even if you're copy pasting stuff, there's bound to be errors in that in that format or in that text block.
Yep.
Not saying
Yep.
that some cloud management offerings nowadays don't have that, but they do have certain checks in place to avoid any human or potential human errors to try and point it out or circumvent it, or at least, again, make it idiot proof.
Yep. Yep. I mean, it reminds me of an old workplace of mine as well, where, I mean, this is going back 10, 12 years. We were very template driven. You had, oh, I can't remember what exactly they're called, but basically you had these commands where you had, here's my entire port configuration for this user type, for the printer type, for, this, that, and the other. And then you would use that to then build your entire port config with one
Mm,
command. And theoretically speaking, you had the exact same experience across every stack. Everything was more or less aligned in terms of what your configuration was. But even then, it wasn't entirely foolproof, right? Because sometimes you'd have little workarounds here and there, or someone might forget to use it. And
and I think that's kind of
yeah,
what drove the development of things like Puppet, Chef, and Ansible. I mean, we pretty much started that. That's how these guys pretty much started, right? They acknowledge the fact that having to configure a thing box by box isn't always the easiest thing to do. It takes ages. Like just earlier, I was having a chat with another engineer. A customer bought uh, tons of switches, and they were worried that it takes 10 hours to configure one switch. And I go, well,
yep,
you don't really have to do that. You have ways of automating that, and you can now turn it into 20 switches in 2 hours.
yep, yep.
And that's not
It
even
actually,
including the cloud management bit.
yep. No, that's right. Like even doing something as simple as like VLAN automation using, some sort of radius service, right? You say, I have a printer, here's its MAC address. I dump that into this database, and hopefully that database then replicates itself into my authentication system, and it goes, boom, when I see X MAC address, this port should be this VLAN and this configuration, right? Something as simple as that. And then that was kind of that first evolution of reducing the amount of work a network engineer had to do. Like we didn't want to go and patch ports. Like, yeah, okay, it's fun to go patch a port, unlock the cabinet and stuff. But when you've done it for the like nth time, it kind of sucks.
That's it. Yeah,
But
it's
network
very cumbersome.
engineers, yeah. But then at the same time, network engineers weren't necessarily ready to hand over the keys to, say you like your local IT guy or whatever, to be able to log into the switch and make those same changes himself or herself, because you couldn't quite trust that they would 100% do it the right way. And so you had to kind of find some sort of automation system to ensure you put like checks and balances in to then be able to sort of hand off that work or automate it entirely, right? It's
Yeah. And on that same
yeah,
note, we're talking about cloud management now. Pretty much cloud. What is cloud? Cloud is just a computer in somebody else's data center, and you're just using part of that resource.
yep,
Some of the more traditionalists would argue that, well, how secure is that? That sounds risky. That sounds like I don't want to share my information with, who knows? Like it goes back all the way with the days of telco. If you think about it, you're pretty much sharing the same telco network with your competitor. And why aren't you
yep,
arguing about that? And that's why we
yep,
kind of introduced these security measures in place, VRF. And interestingly, when you mentioned Salt Typhoon earlier, I mean, geez, we for so long have looked at the telco network as a public, untrusted network, and it's left up to you to kind of safeguard your environment. regardless of
Yep.
whether it's on-prem or cloud-based. Like any sort of management type, whether it be on premises or cloud or a bit of both, it will present its own risks, right?
Yep. Yep. And I mean, there's countless stories out there of people who've left their, VTY lines on their routers out there completely unsecured.
Right.
And they're open ripe for, people to try and brute force login, etc. Right? Like it's yeah, or people there was news stories about people who left management interfaces on firewalls on the outside instead of the inside to make it
Ouch.
accessible from another locate. Like people have done hacks and workarounds to make things happen when they didn't want to, but they kind of had to, right? And but then
Yeah.
that leaves them very exposed, which is not great.
So
Oh God,
if they're
let's
going
not.
to argue, okay, how safe is that cloud solution, or how risky, or what are the sorts of risks involved? It doesn't really. It, if you're a traditional on-prem managed environment, and if you're aware enough of what security measures are needed to harden your infrastructure,
Yeah,
it's not very different whether you do it on-prem or on the cloud. You
yeah,
will still need to pull your weight and, you know, put in the proper security measures in place to a certain standard.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
I always get reminded of this. I've been dabbling on some information security, part of the job, information security study. And one of the more interesting concepts, the most fundamental concepts, is the CIA concept, which is a
Mm,
triangle balance of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's what CIA stands for. So if you want your infrastructure to be secure, you need to have a balance of all three. Because put it this way, the most secure way for you to protect your data is to
mm.
get put that in a physical hard drive or a physical CPU, put it in the storage, lock the door, and throw away the key. But then there's no, you're just putting the confidentiality bit. There's no availability. And you
Yeah,
sure as hell won't have any sort of integrity because you're not accessing the data anyway. So you wouldn't care if it's from a reliable source or not. So,
yeah,
it's always that balancing act. So regardless of whether you're managing your network or your infrastructure on-prem or on the cloud, you gotta you gotta have at least some level of security, but be responsible to put proper
yeah,
security measures in place.
yeah. And I think that's why we see a lot of people now overlaying encryption wherever they can. And hopefully you're using TLS 1.3 and not previous versions that are vulnerable, right?
Mhm.
But like, even treating MPLS links as now untrusted links, right? You don't want your management going over basically the exact same telco routers that the internet flows on, right?
Correct.
Um, yeah, you want that
Yeah.
management to be encrypted. You want it to be solid and all of that information to be held responsibly, like you say. Um, Makes complete sense. So
Yeah,
that
but
takes us
see,
into
yeah,
yes,
I was just to kind of round it off that security topic because we're not really focusing on
sure.
security. But then, look, as a side comment there, I always tell my customers when I talk to them that nowadays, if you're building a network, you're not just thinking about network, you're also thinking about security. You shouldn't treat those two things as separate building blocks. You need to build them from the ground up at the same time. Don't tack on security afterwards. And
100%.
any potential weak links, like interestingly you mentioned, don't use TLS 1. If prior to TLS 1.3. If you are using that and you haven't patched, mate, guess what? It's on you.
Patching, 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 patching,
Patch, always
patching.
patch.
Um, Funnily enough, that's a great little keyword that rolls us into our third topic, which is reliving the term software defined,
Yes.
which was kind of that what you wrote, the next logical evolution towards cloud management. So take me behind your thinking of bringing up that keyword, Fred.
Ah, right. Yeah. So nowadays you'll hear a lot of software defined this, software defined that. Like it all started with a concept called software defined networking. So if I break down that fundamental idea behind software defined networking, or at least when I was studying on it was talking about having a centralized management kind of sitting at a top layer. And then it doesn't matter what endpoints are connected, you can pretty much manage all of those endpoints or physical devices from that central point.
Yep.
Sounds oddly enough, it sounds like what most cloud native or managed or monitored or whatever variant of cloud management there is, because you're pretty much seeing the whole world view from a single point. You're centralizing that management. In this situation, it's in the cloud. It just happens to be sitting in the cloud, and you're pretty much managing and controlling your entire infrastructure from that central point. Now,
Yep.
why did I say that this is the next logical evolution into cloud management? Because think of it this way. We were talking just a few minutes ago about configuring devices on a per device basis and then connecting the wires and hoping that they communicate. Something as simple as a mistype or even a white space on a pre-shared key that needs to be exchanged between two routers. Guys, I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about. In an IPsec exchange or even an OSPF advertisement or a BGP advertisement, even a white space in that key is going to crash or it's like not really crash. I'm dramatic. It's going to fail. It's not going to bring your network up. And
Yep.
you'll easily spend anywhere between half an hour to hours trying to find out what's causing it, only to find out that there's a white space after that security key. Like how cumbersome and painful is that? And that's only two devices. If you're talking about enterprise scale, then you multiply that by, geez, how many hours you'll spend days trying to troubleshoot stuff, and you don't even have an idea of what the whole world looks like if you're not the architect or the engineer deploying that network.
Yep.
So cloud management, again, software defined, whole world view. You're managing everything and then you're seeing everything from a central point, like a console, similar to what Vlad has in his background. You take a look at that and you know what's going on and you know what the world looks like,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yep. It makes me think of a couple of different scenarios and stories I've seen where some people they might vouch for like the Ansible route where, I bring it up on my network, it gets DHCP, I can pass it an option to go look for a config in an FTP server and it pulls down something bare bones, which great. Sure, that can work. If there's a predictable way of, setting, what level is this device at in my hierarchy and stuff like that. And then you go to the next level of, well, now I want to drop ship like a router but I can't because I have to bring that back to my lab to pre-configure it first, to send it out to the shop and do things like that. And then that was that next evolution of, well, now what I do? Now I have to send someone on site still to configure and manage this, at least in
Correct.
its first stage. Now, when I patch that, I have to be on site to patch it in case something happens with the patch and it goes down. Um, and nowadays, these days, like we've moved into cloud management where it's literally zero touch. Like you
Mhm.
plug, you play, you pre-configure everything on a GUI. It just sucks that down and off it goes, right?
That's it.
Which to me is just mind blowing. How dramatically we've made this shift as well, right? Because it was only
Correct.
10 years ago we were still banging away on CLI and it was the normal thing to do, but now it's
It's
considerably
even
different.
unthinkable. Like you'd probably walk into a room and somebody hands you a console cable and you're just gonna sigh in dismay and go, "What the hell do you want me to do?"
I still have a console cable in my drawer, but I have not used it for about
I
at
think
least 5 years.
I've thrown mine out and I'd probably burn it if I see it. It has its uses. It has its uses. Don't hate
I
me.
mean, when you're working with traditional equipment, right, it still has its uses. I get it.
Correct.
Um,
Yes.
but I mean,
I
okay,
mean,
zero touch provisioning, that's one of those
it's
things,
one of
right?
those things, right?
It's one of those things, but what are some other things that I guess, sure you have Ansible, which is doing, say, provisioning of commands, right? Great, cool. But then there's so much more nuance laid on top of cloud managed services that obviously doesn't necessarily cover. Can you take me through just a couple of those, Fred?
Yeah, so I have two, well, there's probably a few more things in that list, but I'll bring up probably two of my favorite topics to talk about. Now, number
Hmm.
one of the immediate benefit, if you call it, you could call it like that. One immediate benefit of having a cloud managed network or a central managed network is then again whole world view. It even makes it easier for, say, a person who's running the business to ask the IT team, what does, you show me all these stuff, you create a report, how does it relate to my business?
Yeah.
If you have that whole world view, like think as simple as managing access list policies or, anything of the sort. Nowadays, you hear stuff like security group tags or ACL or adaptive policy in the world of Meraki. Gone are the days when you have to read through 100 lines of ACLs and have no friggin' idea what those policies mean. And
Yeah.
everyone's
The,
afraid to make changes because they don't know what they will break.
the legacy of engineers gone by, right?
Right. And somebody who wrote that, cheeky line of ACL to permit his peer-to-peer connection probably goes on for years without anyone ever knowing unless you do a regular audit. But the point is, it's very hard to tie technology again back to business outcomes.
Yeah.
Then now we have what we call these matrices that you have. These are the users or the user groups, and then these are the resources. And then you
Yeah.
have that table where you go, do you allow, do you deny? Something as simple as that. It's easy to tie back to a business outcome.
Yep. That makes sense. I mean, you can still retain, your staff VLAN, your printer VLAN, your IoT VLAN, right? But then you can at least be a little bit more visual in your representation of how your policy is based rather than, again, like you say, lots of lines of code, right? And that makes it more repeatable, easier to change, manage, makes sense. Um, I was thinking too, from a patching point of view, I mean, it's literally one click these days, which is just
Mm.
phenomenal.
Firmware
And
management, it's always, I mean, somebody's already thought of the programming logic behind it, which makes it easier for you to decide whether to move to this particular version or that particular version. If you're not sure, read the release notes. If it doesn't ring any alarm bells, then you can schedule ahead and just forget it.
yeah, and apologies to our listeners because I know we've come up on the 28-minute mark, but there's one thing that really kind of hit home to me, and when we started talking about, relating this back to the business, and I think like often you think about the days where nowadays everyone is wireless, right? So back when I was, a network engineer, there was still a lot of people that were cabled into the network, but I don't think there's anyone anymore that's in that case, or at least there's a very minimal number of cases for that now. And now it's a lot of wireless. And I remember troubleshooting wireless issues back in the day. Man,
Yes,
that was
that
difficult
was
because it's very
painful.
much, yeah, time and place, right? Where were you
Yes,
when this happened? What time of day? Did someone shift a
yeah,
cabinet in the office next door that may or may
correct.
not have blocked like access to that AP? And that's why I was working yesterday and not today. There's so much that
That's
can go
right.
on and happen, and you can waste hours trying to troubleshoot an issue, which was just incredible. I think one of the really good points I've seen of cloud managed networks is you now extrapolate a lot of that troubleshooting, a lot of that log analysis. God, the
Correct.
amount of grep on grep on grep that you can do to try and pull together different sources and make something of it. Um,
Oh,
it
I think
makes a lot of sense.
it's fun that you mentioned that. It's funny you mentioned that because, look, sometimes people mistake the idea of having a feature be showing you pretty pictures and pretty graphs of such and such. The question is, do those pretty pictures mean anything to you? Like generating heat maps, for example. troubleshooting wireless and generating heat maps and see which the coverage gaps are. The question is that heat map real time? Like if I actually move a client device, does that heat map actually, warp into something that gives you real time information? If it does, good. Then you probably have a good tool in there. So, pro tip, if you're looking for a cloud managed solution, make sure that that cloud managed solution gives you enough visibility and insights into your network. It doesn't always have to be in the form of a pretty picture. Sometimes all you need are numbers to tell you these numbers don't make sense. It's telling you a story.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
saves you hours and hours of time trying to troubleshoot because it's already there telling you, look, there's probably something wrong here. And you can take a look.
100%. I mean, in this day and age where, people are being asked to come back to the office, I mean, you better make the office internet at least work well, right? And like you say, like heat maps, you know where people congregate. Maybe you don't have enough wireless coverage there. It's one
Correct.
AB trying to service way too many clients, but unless you
That's it.
are actively analyzing that data, there might be a lot of issues that go on that are unreported. And that actually has subsequent, flow onto the business when, my sales guy can't make a phone call or he's banging his laptop because Salesforce is taking forever to, open or, I can't open my PowerPoint. I can't do my job. IT, you suck. I hate you. Like,
That's
things
right.
can escalate, right? And so having that data, it just makes sense. But then having obviously a platform which proactively gives you that too, right? You may have not have known that problem exists, but now you do because there's something that's taking away that effort from you as an engineer doing it, extrapolating it for you, doing it on your behalf, which
Absolutely.
makes it all that more powerful.
Yeah.
And that's going to flow on into a different subject we have keyed up around,
That's
the
right.
office
Yes.
space
We
and
have
hybrid
plans, so
work.
keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, utilizing data to make the network more friendly for you. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'll keep us on point this one for cloud
That's
management.
right. Yeah. So yeah, though, so we're kind of leading up to the close on this episode. So the last point the second point that I wanted to bring up here is kind of also appropriate for some parting thoughts, closing thoughts for our listeners, right? Now, some people will, again, we've talked about how CLI is making you powerful, making you needed because, nobody in their right mind will study years and years to just make sense of what that command spanning tree does. The point is, you're wasting your time trying to configure shit when computers can do a better job at it than you.
Yeah,
You're the human. Don't come down to the level of a computer who can read through text without error. And they're pretty good at that. Be the smart person to try and make use of that tool.
yeah,
Don't worry, the machines, we heard it time and time again since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and now we're hearing it again with AI. Are they going to take our jobs? Well, if you let them, they will. You're the human, you're the one with the brain. You should be the one, be smart enough to make use of these tools. And I promise you, this is leading to that second point. Open APIs, APIs, application programmability interface. This is a topic that will dedicate an episode for it, I promise you. This is something that is, something that I advocate dearly because nowadays cloud management, it's very likely it's almost a certainty that these platforms will offer some kind of open API support,
yeah,
which means, again, if you're a CLI savvy person, guess what? API is the new CLI.
yeah,
Still
yeah,
have some kind of tech knob, nerd knob to be able to play around with. And
yeah,
guess what? These things, pair it with automation and scripting capabilities, it will make you superhuman. Like you can automate stuff that takes hours to finish. And once you're able to write some kind of automation script, you can just keep it running and it'll save you hours and hours of hours of manpower doing the repetitive task, which again I speak to. The machines are pretty good at that. Let them do it.
yeah. Let them do the repetitive tasks. We should be doing the creative ones, right? Makes
Correct.
sense. I mean, you guys here heard it first. Fred's hot take and mine too. Go cloud manage. Like, Sure, it's nice, like Fred said, to be all, to be needed to be powerful. And yet I think if as an IT engineer you aren't already looking to try and automate and make your life easier with the amount of just technology and different things that you have to manage in this day and age, God, we haven't even touched SASE or so many other topics. What if you have an application your business produces as part of what you sell and do, right?
Hmm.
Things have gotten so damn complicated than 10 years ago when we lived on CLI, right? So it's time to move it up, time to
That's it.
evaluate.
We're at the
Can
age
I
of
do things in a better
innovation.
way?
We're at
Yeah.
the age of innovation. Spend that time instead of troubleshooting. Spend that time in innovating.
It, it's interesting. I know we've hit time, but I even read a Reddit thread just yesterday where this guy posted, he said, I've just been 1 year into networking. I've been banging away at CLI. I'm bored already. But banging on CLI keeps me so busy. I don't have time to learn anything else, and I'm stuck. What do I do? And I'm like, man, that's a tough place to be in.
Correct.
And I feel like that's an exact place where cloud management comes in as a solution. Extrapolate the CLI, you still need to know the concepts to manage the network, but take away some of the effort. Give that time back in the day for the user, for the engineer to start thinking about, how to do the next best thing that they need to, whether that's, learning how to create and run AI, do something like that. Managing different parts of the infrastructure, SASE, remote management of desktops, all of these different things that maybe you've got on a Christmas list, right? But you can't because you're still stuck doing things the old way.
Exactly. Yes. So that's a parting thought for you guys. It's a challenge. Are you still allowing yourself to be left in that cage of your own doing, or are you going to spread your wings and, try and play around with the fun stuff? Which Vlad is doing, by the way, a lot lately.
Uh, more on that for a future episode. But on that note, I mean, when we're releasing this, it'll be in January, but we are now wrapping up, moving into Christmas. We're trying to build a bit of backlog so we can, try to release on a semi-relatively stable schedule.
True.
Um, and we are looking forward to recording more in the new year. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you all for listening. See you later.